Greetings, fellow travelers, and welcome to the Way of the Showman, where we view the world through the lens of showmanship. I am Captain Frodo, and I will be your gracious host and guide along the way. This is very exciting. We're about to go on a long journey together. Those of you who followed along in the last season, you will know that I'm a performer, a showman at heart. I'm also a father and a husband, and I kind of feel like, if you haven't met me before, if you're one of the new ones that have just arrived, then I'm so grateful to know that you're with us as well. And if you want to know more about me, more about what I think about the kingdom of childhood, or the mythopoetic origins of showmanship, or any other strange thing that I talked about last time, or you just want to hear a grand epic poem that tells my thoughts on the pandemic and the showman as the captain of the grandest and most famous show or ship of all time, namely the Showmanship, then all of this will be available to you in episode 21 from 1 till 21. And for those of you who are back for more of what we were talking about last time, we'll just add it. The last few episodes in the first season, we spent several episodes talking about, for instance, this concept of the collective imaginary. We spent several episodes talking about getting carny wise, or trying to put a little bit of rational thinking into our tool chest of as getting wise to the world. So for those who've listened before, this won't be brand new, that I will do the same theme on several episodes. I don't know how to use multi in that one there, but that was the word that came out first. So this here will be one long journey, and like all important journeys, it's probably more important that we take this journey together than exactly where we are going. I have, since I spoke to you last, gotten up early in the morning at about 5 to get a couple of hours of writing in before my daughter got up at 7, and we had to start getting ready for school. So then I wrote on my other days. I've only been working a little bit of additional hours as an assistant in a Steiner school here in Norway, as I mentioned in the last episode. Anyway, in amongst all of that, I have been hard at work at shaping my thoughts into one long, cohesive, exploratory journey of what the Way of the Showman actually is. At the beginning of each of these episodes, I say, where we view the world through the lens of showmanship, which is what we have been doing. We have been looking at the world from my highly idiosyncratic point of view, a philosophically inclined performer who has never had another job than doing shows. So what we are doing here in this project that will go on for, I haven't recorded all the episodes yet, even though I have written it, but I'm guessing it might be about 30 episodes, and they will all be interconnected. So the format will change a little bit as I try to describe for you what my lens actually is, so that you too can start to look or share that, or see if there's anything in my lens that resonates with you. Since each of the episodes that are going to go on will be building on the previous one, I won't be doing the preambles that I would do before we entered into the world of ideas in the first season, where I would talk about what's going on in my life and all this. I would like this to become a resource for anyone who wants to put some thought into what the Way of the Showman can be, what it is for me, and by then extrapolation or resonance, they can see what speaks to them. So since each episode builds on the previous episode, I won't chit-chat beforehand. I will do that in separate episodes, which will be called something like a personal detour or so. Every second week these episodes will come out with the next leg of the journey along the way in trying to understand it. So this whole thing will be one long journey. So if you're just joining us, then I will recommend people going back to this episode, and then you can catch up there for the rest of us, and we'll all be waiting for you. If you just come back, then excellent, this is working. As to what our project actually is, I think it's partly a reaction against the kind of ever-pervasive reductionism that we show folk face. And, when people ask us questions like, is this really what you do for a living? And I admit freely that watching us work, our shows, are on the face of it so full of life and joy, and they're just frivolous, and, they're filled with wonder and surprise. People are surprised that someone can spend so much time doing something so useless in terms of practical tasks, but like shopkeeping or family management or whatever it might now be. Learning how to balance a spoon on your nose, or learning how to squeeze yourself through 2 rackets, or do a handstand on just one arm, which is quite astounding but rather useless. Then I'd say that I agree that at first glance these things, what it is that's useful or practical about it is not obvious, because what makes it useful, but in fact what is making this useful is the exact things that people experience when they watch it. It is the very questions of usefulness and the richness and of emotional and intellectual stimulation, and the potential development of intellectual and emotional development that audiences get when they watch it. The fact that they're asking these questions, that's the strength of what we do and the value of it. And I guess that's the value of all art. So this season will be a move against this kind of reductionism of the questions we get of like, is this what you do for a living, or do you have a real job as well? Or when people say it's just entertainment, isn't it? A bit of fun to pass the time. But it's, people might even make the claim that it's not really art, it's just entertainment. And it's in this thing where they go just, or it's mere entertainment. But that's where I think that this is not mere or just anything. So it's an attempt. People might even think that it's not a good way to make a life or answering the biggest important questions. But I think by looking at it in this, looking at the whole craft of showmanship with an open and active imagination, yet keeping one eye on a rational approach, not to go too far, but by looking at this in a sort of mythic, connecting and playful manner, we can find that showmanship, doing circus or sideshow, or performing any kind of carnival arts or ventriloquism or whatever, is not just entertainment or mere entertainment or mere art. It's not just a parsley to put on your main dish. It can be much more than that. And this whole exploration that we're about to embark on is one suggestion, or my attempt to present to the world again what showmanship can be understood as. It's not just representing it to the world, but representing it to ourselves, so that we get a strong foundation and a strong understanding of our place in the world, our role and responsibility, because we have an incredible freedom. We live kind of outside the normal life, and I'm appreciating that as the pandemic hit, when I'm thrown back into a closer interaction with going to work or normal life, or whatever that might mean, of living in one place and all such things. I am appreciating how much of an outsider existence the life of a showman is. And as any outsider, we do face these questions of what is it that you do? Is this a real job? Is this a real thing? And that's what I'm hoping that I can give some foundation for answering in this series. So of course we're going to look through a whole bunch of stuff And as a little overview, we start with a kind of introduction where I talk about, we're going to do that today, talk about how some of these ideas came to me and this sort of duality of how ideas, they've been in me for a long time, but sometimes when they then crystallize, it's like I meet them for the first time and I tell a story of how I wrote what comes to be a poem and how that influenced me and how much I've found in that poem and how far back that goes in me, all that stuff. Then we're looking at, in the episodes coming up after that, we're going to look at what the way of the showman is, and that's going to be quite a few episodes, and looking at how shows reflect the very essence of what it is to be human, and look at it as a way to look at the world and at us as creators. We're going to spend quite a bit of time looking at what I call the two geographies, and a center point between these two geographies, which I call the midway. And from there we will look at different forms of explorations that comes with these two geographies, which, without it being a big spoiler, has to do with the inner experience and the outer experience. These are the two geographies that we will be looking at, and ways to explore those, and the way that the map we make of these explorations becomes the kind of map of ourselves. So we're going to spend an episode or two looking at what it is like to sense something in the world. What role does thinking and feeling and these, because this is what, by looking at some of these most fundamental things, what does it mean to watch something? What does it mean to show something? By spending a little bit of time just actually picking some of these things apart, we can learn a whole lot more about what it is that we really do. And I start really as a base, deep foundation. So in the beginning it might feel a little, you're going, how does this relate to it? But it is because I want to create a little base of things that I find these are important, interhuman and personal things that everybody should, in a way, not should, but everybody can benefit from having thought about them. And if it's just through a half-hour episode of me talking about the differences between thinking and feeling, then when I then go on to talk about how I try to, when I simplify a show down to its bottom constituents of like what is a show fundamentally made up of, then we can see how that really relates to what some of these really deep foundational things of what it means to see something, what it means to show something, and how it is to experience what we see, and how that then reflects in what we want to show for people. So we're going to look at after we look at the deep human things, going what it means to be a human, what it means to experience something, we're going to look at what makes a show. Look at character, material and structure, look at the audience, how these things are reflected in the audience, look at time and space within showmanship, and then we're going to look at what showmanship is. So we sort of build on one thing, building on to the next, and going, why am I interested in showmanship as opposed to just being interested in being a magician or being a contortionist or being a comedian? Why am I talking about showmanship? Where does that come from? And what are then the essentials of showmanship? And from there we're going to look at stuff we talked about in the last season, and how what we do is a kind of process. We might get really nerdy and spend an episode and looking at the relationship between geometry and showmanship, and how by looking at some triangles and some things like that, and the emergence of points on lines, and how we would go, oh wow, this is surprisingly apt for making an illustration and like a picture of what showmanship can be. That's perhaps the most nerdy of the things that I got common. And then we'll look at we'll look at what a showman is. We'll look at where does the spark come from? How do we decide to become performers? And what is the responsibility once we have thought that that's what we want to do? we're going to look at the showman as one who faces the other way, because this I think is an important thing that I will talk about later on in this episode today. I describe the showman as somebody who faces the other way from the crowd, someone who has walked with the crowd but then turned around to face the others, and we spend an episode or two looking at that. Then we're going to look at looking. We're going to look at the eyes. We're going to look at some biological aspects of that, like where did the eyes come from, and what does it look like to look? What does it mean to gaze? What is this connection that comes from that? We're going to look at what our obligation is once you have the attention of all these people watching you. Then we're going to look at this simple transaction of what showmanship is and the responsibility of the performer, because as we know, with great ability comes great responsibility. As wasn't it something like that they said in Spider-Man? Anyway, then we're going to take a little deep dive on audiences. What does it mean to be an audience? What is the role of the audience, and what does it feel like? What is an audience member thinking? And this approach will, in certain sense, make it easier for us when we are creating material to always keep them in mind, to always have this, because we are deeply connected to the audience, and the show is something that emerges between the performer and the audience. And to make that new emergence of the show, make that as powerful and emotional and as affectatious, also that the people can connect to it the most, you need to kind of appreciate the person or persons that are going to meet it and the situations. We're going to talk about that audience. We're going to talk about the attitude that I think is an attitude that I think is very beneficial to have for us, a reverent attitude towards the audience and towards what we do that is different, that changes it from just a guy that makes some balloons on the street, or some guy that just does a couple of jokes and does a bit of juggling in the local scout club, and to see how a subtle change of attitude in us towards what we do, just in the words we use and the way we think about it, can help us re-examine our relationships to our audience and to money and to all these things. Then after that, we're going to look at art and entertainment. What is art and what is entertainment, and what do we do? And after having looked at that at some length, we're going to look at an example from Goethe's Faust, who has a very interesting first chapter in his book on Faust, where there's a interesting conversation between a jester and a poet that have been brought together by the manager of a theater, or a producer of a show, I guess we would call it today, that he wants to put on a show, and he expresses his concerns as to what a show is. And then from there, I think we will sort of see that some of these questions that we ask ourselves of that we feel are very relevant today, but the internet and stuff being a huge distractor, and that the audience have seen everything, that this very same idea has been around since the late 1700s, early 1800s, when Goethe wrote this play. And from there, we're going to look at attention. Well, that's this very important part of what it is that we do, because in a really important way, I could say that a showman is somebody who refines and manipulates attention. We ask for attention from our audiences, and then we present something. We present some material, and the thing, the activity that's going on with the audience, that's attention, and we ask for it when we blow a whistle on the street and try and do a street show, or when we step out onto the stage. And what is attention? So by understanding a little bit more what this tension that appears between us, the attentive tension, by understanding that a little bit more and looking at it, we can also learn a little more about how to shape our material. Then we're going to look at a show. What is a show? That's the structure, how does it work, a couple of different aspects of what shows are. And then we're going to try to connect all of this stuff together connecting in what we've learnt about what it is to be human, what we've learnt about attention, what we've learnt about what shows is, what we've learnt about what the goals are for the way and our responsibilities, and we're going to try to weave all of this together and see if we can see some connections and, like I say, a couple of practical lessons towards what we how this could then be applied directly in creating an act or creating a show. And as we do that bringing together, it's not a huge spoiler to say that we're going to talk about all the ways that this is similar to what playing is, the human act of playfully getting together and connecting and losing oneself in games, the games we play. So it's got we end up with this kind of thing where I talk about what I call three-dimensional showmanship. That almost starts in that thing I talked about with geometry, of where we will find the images of triangles and things that will evolve into a pyramid, that will evolve into a bipyramid, and this kind of stuff. This is just this image that I have created that helps clarify it in my mind, so it's easier to remember some of these things. So yeah, there will be, along the way, there will be poetry, there will be stories of me traveling around Europe in an ambulance with a freak show, and they'll all be, so this is the kind of a little scope of what it is that we're going to do. And it's the introduction, so I thought it might be good to just quickly sort of talk through it all and be very vague, but still, all the things I've said are actually quite specific, so we will get flesh onto those bones as we go. Alright, now, before we go on, I'd just like to say a few words on gender, because I'm of course fully aware, and it does irk me that the word showman is gendered. This is unfortunate, but since this word, as we will discover when we go on here, is kind of integral to my thinking, and it has shaped my whole enterprise, I still find it, showman, that word, very rich and useful, and the way I use it is not gendered. So just like when you're reading an academic text, you're reading it in let me explain what I'm talking about, because the show part of the word showman, I use that as, it's kind of uncontroversial, and I use it even if it's an expanded and developed sense, I use that as it is used and understood in common parlance and normal talking. But the second word, the man part of showman, this one, I don't interpret that as a male human being, but as a human being in general. This is an integral part of my thinking. I genuinely think of the way as valuable, and a valuable approach to life and learning for everyone, not just people who do shows for a living or even just for artists, and certainly not restricted to any persons of any specific gender or whatever they might experience themselves as. So interpreting the man part of showman to mean human being is not sort of common in the use of the word showman. But the interpretation is not new. Rather, to the contrary, it's a kind of older way of denoting human beings, like how the word is part of the word human, or in a dictionary, this use of the word is the second listed as a human being of either sex. And when I use the word showman, I actually mean, or talking about, a show human. That's also the word that we use in mankind. So this doesn't stop me from sometimes using the more inclusive show folk when appropriate, or performer or so, but as we shall pry the word showman apart and look at all the different ways those two words actually inform what the showman is and what the showman does, and the inner and outer aspects of what a showman is, then I think the use of the word man in showman will take some of the sting of that gendered approach, gendered interpretation of it. It's a good thing that society is moving away from all these gendered combining forms of denoting occupations or roles, such as fireman or chairman or mailman. And as the father to a daughter, I do want her to know that she can be anything she wants, and sexism is everywhere, insidiously woven even into language. But language is also just that. It is what we read into it. And I want to read into it and place a slightly different meaning, much expanded and much depth I hope to add to this. Now, after that disclaimer and that introduction, it's ready for the first chapter and venture into the world of ideas, and that is, that is the introduction. Here it comes. The Illuminated Showman's Manifesto. I am a showman. First and foremost, it's a showman I am. The Illuminated Showman is someone who faces the other way, who has walked with the crowd, then turned around to face the others. The Illuminated Showman is someone who faces the other way, who has walked with the crowd, then turned around to face the others. And the showman cries for attention and has something to show when he gets it. For a showman shows man. The showman cries for attention and has something to show when he gets it. And the showman shows man, revealing the pulsing meat of human experience and reminding us of the inherent folly of all human endeavor. For when we are laughing at the clown, we are laughing at ourselves. When a showman performs on a market square, he creates a universe. Like the sun above, he attracts random bodies moving through space. Like planets, they gather orderly around him. And the gravity of the showman warps time, and it warps space. For he creates a universe on that market square. Like the sun above, he attracts random bodies traveling through space. And like planets, they gather orderly around him. And the gravity of the showman warps time and warps space. And in this warped state, he steals the crowd's time. But like a twisted, alchemical Robin Hood, he returns it refined. He returns it refined as showtime. 100% artificial, and therefore completely human. I am a showman. I am a showman. And first and foremost, it's a showman I am. Now this text, it came to me like a transmission from the stars. It's like a transmission from inner space. But it was like a transmission from the stars, which was proof of life out there. And the confirmation that I'd been seeking. Like any alien message, once received, it needed to be interpreted and understood. And this bit of writing is more to me than just a quote or a poem at the beginning of this journey that we're about to head out on. In a very real sense, it was how the way manifested itself to me. So go back, listen to that again, and do some repeats there so you can get into it. But that thing that will become a thread through this entire work. Because I had been playing with these ideas for years, but in the way that this text arrived, fully formed, when called for, it made it feel like it came to me as opposed to from me. And the text came to me as pretty much as I have said it here. I've not really subtracted or added anything in any substantial way. It came in one spontaneous outpour whilst I was in the process of writing a new show. I had a specific aim in mind, and this aim was kind of the tuning in. I sat with pen to paper, ready and waiting in earnest and open interest, and the manifesto, as I came to call it, arrived like a message from one world to another, but not from intergalactic space to an Earth observatory, but, as I mentioned, from my inner space, from my inner geography out into the outer world geography, onto the paper that I was writing on. I've thought about it afterwards as like the kind of automatic writing that happened to the Spiritism mediums at the end of the 1800s. And I've also thought that it resembled the way that a poem comes to a poet, but in the way that it comes when it's portrayed in a movie or a book, like it just floats along. I'd like to say that this poem hit me like a crate of cartoon anvils, making me shout Eureka and run naked through the street, but I'd be lying. I wrote it. I liked it enough to feel that I'd done something valuable for the show that I was working on, but I thought of it as a placeholder. I didn't feel like I'd been granted a gift from J. Joe, the patron saint of clowns. I did not even notice that it appeared fully formed. I often write page after page with notes, and I didn't know that this page would be different. Most of the time when you write something, you write it and then you rewrite it and you fix some stuff and then you rewrite it and then you fix it again and then you throw the whole thing away and then you write it all again from memory, and finally when you've fixed it up a little bit, that bit, then it begins to make some sense and start to be good. I assumed that it was what I'd written was a first draft that I would rework and add to. The way that it read, the way that I read it just seems sort of like a straightforward description of what a showman doing a show. That's like what it looked like to me. I didn't think much about it, yet the more I worked with it and changed and rewrote the show manuscript around this manifesto, this just stayed unchanged and singular. I thought I'd get back to it and start working on it, but every time when I started reading it out aloud as the placeholder it was, I felt I couldn't quite improve or add to it. I kept thinking that I would soon get to it and work out what was wrong or whatever. But the moment it came to me, the manifesto, I was in the midst of writing a 1-hour solo performance. After about 5 years of performing 8 shows a week with a troupe of cabaret performers, which at first was called La Clique and then changed its name to La Soirée, I'd come to a point in my life where I wanted to express something deeper than I can squeeze myself through 2 tennis rackets, and I wanted to present something which wasn't just jokes and strange, silly tricks. Because to me there was something more to the performing craft, and I just didn't have the necessary vocabulary to express it. So I think this was in 2011. And I sat on the floor in my wife's childhood home in Melbourne, Australia, with my collection of notebooks, loose scraps of paper, and my computer open. I was reading, drawing lines, mind maps, and trying to gather my notes into a working script for an upcoming solo performance at an intimate cabaret venue called the Butterfly Club. There were books lying open with lots of bits of paper sticking out from between significant pages, circus books, a book about the history of Freemasonry. There were some books on magic by Jim Steinmeier, a university textbook on psychology, which I think literally was called Psychology 101, books on mythology, Mircea Eliade's The Sacred and the Profane, and there was classical music playing, probably Bach, as it often is. And in this first part of the explicit creative process, the process of creation, when I first started putting pen to paper on the show manuscript, when I do that, and any manuscript really, when I'm working on a show, I drift around through my ideas, glancing into notebooks, jumping from an idea in a moleskin diary to some fastidiously copied pages from an old book about circus, to some text on a computer that I wrote, or something that I've read, some underlined and marked texts in open books around me on the floor. I'm sort of trying to gather my thoughts from the last bit of time, and I looked over the sort of temporary list of acts and skills that I wanted to include, and in my head I'm trying to get a grasp on what I've thought about the show up until then, get an overview of the goals, desires, and the emotions that I'd like to explore, or that I want the audience to have. And this fleeting from one thing to the next is a vital part of this stage of the process. I let the pattern recognition machinery and meaning-seeking processes of my mind work their magic. And since I just mentioned the Butterfly Club, where I was going to premiere this show, the flitting flight of a butterfly from flower to flower seeking the sweet nectar from their interiors springs easily to mind. And as I kept writing the show, making running orders where I'd look for themes and shapes, structures inherent in the material, all the stuff that I already had for the show, I decided I wanted to have a kind of opening speech in the show. I thought that if I could declare and speak a text or a poem sort of right near the top of the show, and if I could deliver it with enough pathos and conviction, it could serve as a kind of pointer for the audience. It could perhaps set a tone and a vibe that would color the way they viewed the rest of the show, give them a kind of idea of the framing of how to view the material in the show. So I began looking through my notes for something to say and something that would point to the deep and rich domains that I felt was present, but it was just beyond myself and my ability to express it. And when I say it like this, it's obvious to you which text I ended up choosing. But perhaps surprisingly, it wasn't obvious to me at the time. It took quite a while before I landed on the manifesto. But when I did, I noticed the sort of odd stances in my notebook, and as I memorized the text and began rehearsing and the performance of it, the sense of the text's significance grew on me, because it was just one of the texts that I had sort of produced in this fleeting jumping back and forth, and I need this something, and I collected stuff and put it together, and this text then sort of just rolled out of me onto the page. And as I had rehearsed it and started to perform it, well, not perform it in an actual show yet, but just go down into the garage and speak it out loud, and I added some exaggerated and grand kind of movements, some of the peculiar kind of dance or gestural movements that's called eurythmy that I'd learned as a student at a Steiner school or Waldorf school. It's the kind of stuff that allows a Steiner student to dance their name because of its relation of movement to words spoken. And I added some magic as well to the thing and other dramaturgic elements, but all of that stuff that I added to it was used to emphasize the text and to nurture a feeling that lived on the border between the profound and the ridiculous. And the style and the content was very different from anything that I'd ever done before. It felt good to do it, like I was on the trail of something important. And as the importance of the manifesto grew on me, the odd origin of the text became significance. Did this poem thing just pop out of me like Athena from Zeus's head? And even if, because thinking of Athena, she was actually the goddess of crafts, and the manifesto became the origin of me thinking of showmanship as a craft. So nothing comes from nothing. So to work out where this poem then had come to, this happened kind of after I'd already done the show and everything, and I actually started to go, why is this seem so significant? And it served the purpose very well. It did make people feel like it was like, oh, okay, this is something. People paid attention in a way that they don't pay attention to me just doing jokes, which is exactly what I hoped I would get. So I began to look through my notebooks to find where these ideas that made up the manifesto came from. And slowly going backwards, I sort of discovered the sort of birth of an idea. Because when I go through my notebooks, I frequently discover that I've gotten the same idea many times. Ideas are effervescent things, wanting to evaporate like gasoline on hot tarmac, if not immediately written down. They're like dreams in this regard, vivid and real when you first wake, but almost immediately they begin to lose their firmness, as if the waking state of mind, trying to grasp it and hold it fast, makes it come asunder, like the very act of holding onto it makes it flow like water between the fingers of my grasping mind. Going through my notebooks, I can often trace how an idea has been haunting me. I might find the idea in quite a sketched and embryonic form, and then other ideas come, and new quotes from books and articles and the internet appear in the book, and it's just the daily thoughts and in the notebook. But then flicking through some further pages forward, some ideas they come back. And often I can see from the way that I have written them that I probably can't remember that I have had this idea before. Sometimes I write the same thing in different words, but other times it reappears in almost exactly the same words. This is kind of rare. Most of the text which arrives fully formed might be single phrases or single sentences. And it's like every time I have the idea again, it finds more of its form. And with each subsequent visitation by an idea, the idea gets more fleshed out and connected to other ideas. Like the embryo has kind of grown. It's more substantial, and as the idea grows, it becomes more solid, less of a ghost or a haunting. As with any gestating life, it gets stronger and more viable the more it grows. And from the first few notes, I can see in the notebook that there is life present. As the words grow to outline the idea and connect bits of information, the idea materializes and grows more robust. So seeking the manifesto's origins, I didn't find much of the actual text. What I found was a string of notes tracing a sort of nebulous, foggy desire to create a piece that I could deliver with great pathos at the beginning of the show, as I mentioned before. Like, I found notes talking about the drawing on the dual nature of the clown, of being at once silly and profound, like how Chaplin could make you laugh with the slapstick of his tramp and then move you to tears with his fabulous speech as the dictator, and find something that will induce a mood, is another note, in the audience, making them receptive to a deeper way of understanding my acts. And at some point in my notebook I see that I begin to use the word legend. For instance, one hurriedly scribbled note said, "Tell the legend of the sacred showman." Now, I didn't know any such legend, and I still don't quite, but I wanted to know one. And I wanted to tell it. I wanted to exist in a world where I knew that legend. A legend which would serve as a key for deciphering the rest of what was coming in the show. And later in my notes, this word legend was underlined and bits was copied out from a dictionary. And as it turns out, the word legend has several meanings, and all of them seemed relevant to the mood that I wanted to instill in the audience, and the effect that I wanted it to have as a guide for interpreting the rest of the show. And the first dictionary meaning of legend is a traditional story which commonly is regarded as rooted in history, but which is unauthenticated. And the next explanatory definition I had underlined was map legend. And a map is a symbolic representation of relationships between elements of space, whether it's geographical or more abstract, like in ideas or themes. And a map legend is the description or explanation or table of symbols that's printed in the corner of the map or chart, so that the person looking at it can interpret the abstract map drawing. It tells you what the symbols on the map mean, and it usually also contains information about the scale of the map and stuff like that. It might show that, a small cross means a church, a little tent means a campground, and a big tent means a big top, things like that. My notes indicate that I wanted the legend of the sacred showman, which is kind of how the feeling of what I wanted to do with the manifesto. This legend of the showman or the manifesto could encompass both of those meanings of the word legend. I wanted the manifesto, which I didn't know that it was going to be called that, but I wanted it to be in the form of a quasi-historical story legend, but serve the role of a map legend. So this is the kind of stuff that I was finding in my notebook. And the idea I was seeing in the pregnant belly of my mind laid out in the pages of my craft journal, my notebook, was an act. It was a piece to be presented that expressed the depths I felt lived in what I did with my life, meaning being a showman. I wanted to show the audience a glimpse of the depth that I saw in the craft of showmanship, and in the process of wanting to show them, I was also discovering it for myself, because to me there was something more to the deep desire and connection that I felt in doing shows and creating acts for others to enjoy, and it all felt so right for me. It deeply and meaningfully connected me to the world and also gave me a place to belong within it. And this feeling, this has been with me as far back as I can remember. But the feeling was so large and all-encompassing that I couldn't adequately express it. And that's where this poem is one of these first bits where I would read it and looking back at it, I go, okay, here, it's like I'm interpreting a poem that's been given to me. Now, just a couple of thoughts here on some possible even deeper origins of this idea. As I was thinking back to some panel discussion that I was at a circus festival in Wollongong, and I think this Wollongong is in Australia outside Sydney in 2004, was organised by Circus Monoxide. And I remember trying to express this feeling there. That's the first time when I consciously can remember that I tried to express it and fell short. But still, all I could think of there to say when I got the word was that, in the panel, I was just in the audience at that, and I just wanted to say something. And all that I could say that was that performing circus was the thing in my life that made me the most happy, and it was the thing I did which made all of my disparate and varied interests and passions come together. It was how I got into a flow state, and it was how I found my groove. I think circus is the thing that makes me fit into the world, the context that allows me as an odd piece to fit into the greater jigsaw puzzle of life. I don't think I was quite as eloquent as that, but when I'm sitting here trying to formulate myself, then that's what comes out. And in that panel discussion, I called what I do circus. Other times I've called the world that I inhabit a carnival, and both of these places can be grand institutions of belonging for showfolk. They're organizational structures for showfolk to come together and present their craft or their art of entertainment. And I used the circus and carnival terms because they were larger and they encompassed more than me just as a funny contortionist or a sideshow performer. I had to use bigger and more inclusive terms because what I felt and thought did in no way feel like it just applied to me. It was a community thing. It's like it was a whole thing. It was a way. And performing made me feel like I was doing something that made me relevant and made me matter to the world. Audiences laughing and dropping money in my hat after my street shows, or paying before they came to see me in the theatre. And that showed me that the world, at least a small part of it, was not just telling me that I was doing the right thing. They were putting their money where their mouth was. They were paying as well as saying. And they didn't just smile and laugh and clap. As they paid me, they gave me worth, both existentially and fiscally, as in monetarily. This panel at that festival was the first time when I publicly, straight out, just attempted to put a voice, even if it fell short, put a voice to this feeling of all-encompassing depth and meaningful showmanship and circus and blah, 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 as my wife says. It wasn't very well articulated. It was more like an emotional outpour, and it was kind of like my coming out as a showman, even if not much fuss ensued. And after the panel, I went back to the bent metal chairs outside the caravan I was staying in at the time, and the building housing the festival was right next to a train line, and I'd been given permission to stay in a caravan immediately next to the train line there. And huge freight trains thundered past, and each so long that it seemed to go on forever, and I was a few weeks away from going to Sydney to begin the creation of a show called The Carnival Goes On at the Sydney Opera House, which was a collaboration between my group of freaks called the Happy Sideshow and an extraordinary band of musicians called Michelangelo and the Black Sea Gentlemen. It was a magical moment in my life. My long-term relationship was unraveling in the most awful way, and the Happy Sideshow was also coming apart in its interpersonal seams, and trains rolled off into the distance, and the world was both collapsing and opening up. It was a crisis in the Chinese sense of the concept, and the Chinese symbol for crisis is made up of two signs, one meaning danger and the other meaning new opportunity. So, this gets us back to the seemingly frivolous affair that I have with performance. Because to the uninitiated, making people laugh and clap at ridiculous things doesn't seem like a serious business. If all you do when you go to work is to stand on a street corner waving a rubber chicken about whilst blowing a whistle, this is a very understandable response. There's something inherently frivolous and light-hearted about the craft of showmanship. But already, let's make a mental note that this is not necessarily a detrimental feature. When we perform any of the circus or carnival arts, we are joyous and they are enjoyable experiences. And the term for our kind of activity is a novelty act. We're supposed to have the feeling of something new and unusual. With a positive slant, we might say that we are original, or at least, the very least, experienced as such by the spectators, even if we're doing what feels like old material. Yet the chances are that some people think of what we do just as vacuous entertainment, a bit of fun to give a laugh before getting back to the serious things in life, like spreadsheets and neckties and cubicle office spaces, commuting, mortgage payments, and in short, real work. Few occupations so readily begs the question, what is your real job, or is this what you do for a living? My own grandpa would ask me this with some regularity. Or when are you going to get a real job? And when this question was first posed to me, I was still in school. I was living with my parents and performing in my dad's magic show, as part of Santini's magic show. And then the question wasn't when I would get a real job, but what are you going to do when you finish school? Even though I spent most of my time learning how to juggle, to perform magic, to eat fire, and shove metal things into my head, either through my nose or down my throat, I don't think anymore, not even me, that though these odd things were something that I could make a living from. I was doing them, but I wasn't fully thinking that this would be my living. It was just assumed by everyone, including myself at that time, that I would get a real occupation as well. Part of the reason that I also thought this was that my father was, and still is, a magician, but my father was an amateur magician, and by that I don't mean that he was inferior to a professional magician, only that he always had a real job, as well as doing shows. His passion was in performing and doing shows and inventing magic tricks, but he also had a real job. 10 years old, I became my dad's assistant in his magic show. And that show was called, as I said, or he was called The Great Santini, and I was Santini Jr., and our show was the Santini's Magic Show. Our show as a magic duo became very popular in the local area. And some years we did more than 100 shows, 120 shows. And considering that my father, the Great Santini, always was in full employ, even if he was self-employed, which usually means you work even more, and that I was in school, that doing 120 shows in a year, that is a whole lot of performances for two amateur magicians. And very frequently, boys want to be like their dad, and I was no exception. So I thought that I wanted to be a magician, and he had a normal job as well, so I assumed that this would be my way too. I would do shows, but I would have another more secure and more serious occupation. Something which I would secure that I would make a decent living and that I would be taken as a serious member of the community. And for a long time I thought that that other thing was going to be a veterinarian. I spent 2 years working as an unpaid veterinary's assistant, reading up on animal care and welfare. And when I finished school, I did a course at the University of Oslo in philosophy, logic, and the history of ideas. And at the end of that course, still infatuated with myths, I wanted to study comparative religion. Then I bought all the books on that reading list for the first 6 months of that course, but I decided that I was going to read them whilst living and working in a Camp Hill farm, like a village in the Norwegian countryside. And that farm is like a village community based on the work of Rudolf Steiner. It's a farm, but it also provides support for the education, employment, and daily lives of adults and children with developmental disabilities, mental health problems, or other special needs. So whilst on that farm, I was planning and organizing Norway's first juggling convention, and in May 1996 I rented the school that I'd spent 12 years at and had 150 jugglers from all over Norway and a small gang from the UK all gather and share juggling skills and put on shows for each other and for the general public. During my stay at this farm, whilst planning the juggling festival, the two friends whom I was organizing the festival with asked me if I wanted to go to England once the festival was over to do a 3-month course in circus and physical theatre at Circomedia Academy of Physical Theatre and Circus. And I did want to do that. So, as soon as the festival was over, we jumped into a car and set off on the journey, performing shows on the street to fund our travels and lives of freedom. And I did intend to go back to my religious studies, but I decided I would do that after the circus course. And I've still not quite gotten back to those studies, not in any formal way anyway, even though I've never stopped reading about it. Showmanship always seemed to get between me and getting a real job. So, let's get back to the manifesto, because it's funny how decisions taken on a whim, or how some text written in a flurry of creativity can end up defining so much of your life. The text that became the Illuminated Showman's manifesto and affected big parts of my life after that, as little as it was, it became my impasse to this much larger conversation about showmanship. At the time I received a manifesto transmission from my leading star, I did not recognize that it was a microcosmos of my macrocosmos. It just seemed to be a description of a showman doing a show, but as I kept working with it, declaring it and performing it over and over for my audiences, I found it to be a lot more than that. It grew on me, or grew into me, and I understood more and more of what it carried within it. And the process reminds me of something that the Irish-English, now living in America, poet David White often says in interviews, that poetry is often the art of overhearing yourself saying things you didn't know you knew. Poetry is often the art of overhearing yourself say things you didn't know you knew. It is a learned skill to force yourself to articulate your life, your present world, or your possibilities for the future. So with this in mind, in this light, the manifesto is a poem, and each time I presented the poem as an act in a show for an audience, I was also witnessing the performance. I was overhearing myself say the things I didn't know I knew. Hidden in the words, I discovered meanings and layers deeper than I had known, and with each telling of the poem, I could, through inflection, gesticulation and gestures, and eventually a magic trick, express these new depths, which had been revealed to me slowly, and in this way the act got stronger, the act or the performance of the poem got stronger, and the poem could express more and more for the audience. And with me as a guide in my expressive telling of the manifesto, I could give them a far richer first experience of the poem than I had had when I first read over my spontaneous creation, sitting upstairs at my mother-in-law's house trying to write down the beginnings of a show. And with that, the first leg of our journey comes to an end. We have had an introduction and we've had a bit of an overview of what will come in the next, what's looking like it's going to be the next year. And I'm very much looking forward to walking this way with you and share you some of the sights that I have seen and felt and discovered and thought along the way of the showman. If what I've said triggers any thoughts in you, if any of the previous episodes triggers any thoughts in you, or you would like to get together virtually or in the real world and talk about some of your ideas and what of my ideas could influence some of those to work on a show, to work on an act, or just to talk about the life of a performer in any shape or form, then send me an email at theWayoftheshowman@gmail.com, or you can contact me on Facebook on Captain Frodo, or you can look at my website captainfrodo.com or thewayoftheshowman.com. That's the same place. And last but not least, my wife has found this excellent little place where you can actually buy me a coffee. It's a kind of donation-based website that's called buymeacoffee.com, and if you type in buymeacoffee.com/CaptainFrodo, you will get to me. And there's a simple little button you can click there, and you can buy me a coffee for $5 or a couple of coffees or 3 coffees. As I see it, I'm sure if this was a conversation that we'd just had in the flesh, I'm sure you would buy me a coffee. And last season there was a few people who contacted me and said, is there any way that I can support you? And I said, no, there isn't, but next season I will have a book out for you to buy. Now I have decided to give you that book as the whole season, this coming season. So instead of buying a book, you can now buy me a coffee. It's buymeacoffee.com/CaptainFrodo. I hope to have a coffee with you soon. So, with all that said, all that's left to be said before I let you go out into the world until we get back on the way together is take care of yourself and those you love, and I really hope to see you along the way.